This module covers cash management. The annual operating budget shows an annual estimate of the revenues and expenditures that are expected during the year. For example, it would show patient fees as a single amount that is the expected total for the full 12 months of the year. However, we know that the amount of patient fees will vary daily, weekly, and monthly. For that reason, we have to track the actual collection of cash received daily because we have to pay bills daily. Matching cash inflows to cash outflows is reflected in a cash budget. This process allows us to anticipate periods of cash surplus and cash shortage so we can make plans accordingly. Cash is the lifeblood of any organization. It has to be managed carefully and systematically. Managing cash flow is critical. We will answer 4 basic questions. How much cash do we have? How much cash should we hold? How do we cover cash deficits? And how do we identify problems with cash flow? The answer to the question of how much cash do we have is determined by the amount of outflows and inflows. Disbursements, or outflows, are when an obligation to pay occurs. This means examining every bill to identify the due date and payment terms. A common approach is to delay making payment until it's due, unless you can get a discount for paying early. Receipts or inflows occur when goods and services are delivered by your organization. It makes sense to get payment as soon as possible, ideally at the time of delivering the service. Otherwise, it can take a long time to get paid, thereby delaying your cash inflow. The goal is to match inflows to outflows almost daily. Why? In providing a service, there's a cash outflow to pay staff wages and to buy the materials and supplies needed for client services. It makes sense then to get enough cash inflows during that same period, whether it's daily, weekly, or monthly. Again, the goal is to match inflows to outflows. This brings to mind 2 situations that may arise. First, what if you get central government money or donor money ahead of actually providing the services they are funding? In that case, you get to hold cash inflows well before there are cash outflows. You have to have a plan for how to save and invest that money until it's needed. Second, maybe more likely is that the laboratory has to provide services before getting the money from the donor or the central government. What then? In that case, you have cash outflows before the cash inflows, creating a cash deficit. Again, you have to plan on how to deal with the cash deficit. The next slides examine these situations. Having idle cash is the best situation. There are 4 basic reasons to hold cash. Transaction amounts is where cash is needed to cover outstanding bills or other outflow transactions. This is the essential reason to hold cash. Precautionary amounts is to meet unanticipated expenses. This is another essential reason to hold cash. Speculative amounts refers to holding cash in order to take advantage of pricing and investment opportunities in the marketplace. Finally, financial amounts refers to building up cash savings in order to acquire future assets or begin a major new program. The goal is to avoid a cash deficit at all times. However, there are ways to deal with cash deficits. It's best to identify them ahead of time and not wait until it's too late. One method is to delay outflows or disbursements. Pay the most essential bills first to avoid having to shut down all operations. Delay paying bills that have no late penalties or lower penalties than other bills. Another method is to accelerate receipts or inflows. Provide incentives for early payment, such as a discount. This works well for major clients that represent a large amount of money. When there are long, overdue amounts owed to your organization, you may want to consider outsourcing the collection to a professional bill collector. Now, this introduces other questions. You have to pay for that collection service, so it means that you will not get 100% of the bill owed. The bill collector will take some of the amount. What is the discount to face amount that you're willing to accept? Is it 50% of the original amount, 75%, or some other amount? You have to determine the amount of the original amount owed that you are willing to forego by getting someone else to collect the money. The ethics of the bill collector service has to be considered before outsourcing the work. Of course, there should be no physical or other strong-arm coercion effort allowed. Even harassment of the overdue client raises ethical concerns. There are additional steps that might be available to gain funding. Perhaps a vendor offers a credit line or a way to delay payment in return for paying them interest until you can pay off the bill. Or, if there is idle cash in another program and the rules allow, then you might be able to borrow that cash for a short period with the agreement to return it by a certain date. You should go beyond just reimbursing that program account. You should pay it an interest rate similar to what you would have had to pay a bank to use their money. Finally, the last option is to borrow money from an outside lender, such as a bank, but this will also require you to pay interest charges. Bank financing has certain characteristics to consider. A bank will charge interest on the use of their money. Their interest rate or charge is tied to their assessment of the probability of getting money back on time and in full. If your organization has a good credit standing, it can borrow money cheaper than another organization that has bad habits. For these reasons, it's best to borrow money only when it advances major goals and objectives. The tighter you can make the case, the better. Banks do not like to see repeated borrowing requests, so it's best to apply once in the year based upon solid estimates of cash flow needs. When you make repeated trips to the bank looking to borrow money, it just screams poor cash management on your part. Bank borrowing is easiest when you least need it. I know that sounds odd, but the purpose of borrowing when you don't need the money is to establish a solid banking relationship where they know that you will pay back the full amount on time. Be realistic and recognize that the bank financing process can take a lot of time. Start the process as soon as you think you may need a loan. If you borrow, keep your banker informed on the status of your financial condition. Give the banker regular reports. Bankers don't like surprises. Watch for signs of cash flow problems, including these. Cash balances have dropped consistently below historical levels. Or, demand for services have dropped, meaning fewer clients are being served, so less money is being taken in from client payments. Or, there's a significant delay in receiving grant funding transfers. Or, payments to vendors are consistently late, since most vendors want to be paid within 30 days. An increase in amounts owed over 30 days is a warning sign. Or, major purchases are being postponed. Or management has become very strict about spending any money. Or finally, banks and other lenders are requesting more financial information about the organization and its finances. These are some of the most common warning signs that you may have a cash flow problem and may need to find a solution. What if your organization has money that it's not currently using? The ideal is to be able to invest the money until it's needed, thereby earning some interest on the principal amount invested. The local bank may pay interest on deposits in the bank account. Of course, there are many other investment options, but most aren't proper for organizations dependent upon government or donor money. There are certain objectives or principles to follow in writing the policies and procedures for investing idle cash. Safety of principal is the most important objective. You want to get back what you invested. If your laboratory receives money from the government, then that money is taxpayer money. Citizens don't like to see it wasted or misused. Thus, you have to follow policies that will preserve that money until it's used for its proper purpose. Liquidity is the availability of the money when needed. If the idle cash is needed in 6 months to cover expected cash deficits, then the investment must mature before it's needed. Yield refers to the return on the investment, or interest earnings. Never trade yield for safety of principal. Legality is there to remind you to follow all laws and policies. All too frequently, certain bankers and others may encourage you to invest the money in some scheme they're pushing. Be cautious. Always check if the laws allow it and if it meets all the other points on this list. Although the law may allow some types of investments, is it really suitable for your organization? It's better to be cautious in making any investments. What if the idle cash does accumulate enough to make investments that produce earnings or interest? What then? If there is a recurring amount of interest earnings, then that amount should be part of the normal budget process. But if interest earnings are wildly fluctuating annually, then it's likely due to varying amounts of idle cash that can change at unpredictable points. In that case, planning a budget that is dependent upon interest earnings may be a mistake. Instead, the interest earnings from one year could be saved and then spent in the following year. In that case, you'd know exactly how much to budget since it was all collected last year. Here's an example of a cash budget. At the top, it shows the beginning cash balance and the cash inflows from clients and others to produce the total cash available per month. Below that section are disbursements, or outflows of cash, which occur when paying staff and for other purposes. The difference between cash in and cash out is the ending cash balance. In this example, every month produces a positive cash flow. If only every organization was so lucky. All too common, there are months facing a cash deficit and other months with a cash surplus. It's under those situations where management has to use many of the tools we've been talking about. Up to this point, we've introduced many of the elements of cash management, but it may help to think in terms of the steps in a cash management process. First, establish a cash management policy that emphasizes the preservation of money over the earnings or yield that may result. Next, track the inflows and outflows of cash. A cash budget will help with this. From that cash budget, you can determine the minimum cash to hold to cover bills as they come due, and when any remaining amount termed idle cash will be needed. If you have idle cash, identify appropriate investment instruments to buy with that idle cash. You'll want to solicit competitive bids from different bankers so you know you're getting the best result, defined as the highest interest rate that is consistent with your stated policy. Monitor all the investments. Read all the statements and reports from your bankers. When it matures, redeem the principal and interest as scheduled. And finally, report investment performance to all stakeholders so there's a full accountability. There is a special cash management topic that deserves our attention. Many organizations have a small amount of money set aside as petty cash, also termed an imprest account. This account, or box of money, is used for certain specific needs, such as bus fares, calls from the public telephone box, or other small purchase items. A petty cash book is needed with entries from each withdrawal of cash and its purpose and recipient. The petty cash book is given each day or week to the bookkeeper or cashier, with the supporting receipts showing what the cash was used for and by whom. The amount of petty cash is then restored to its original level. The reason for a petty cash box is to avoid having an elaborate approval and tracking system for very small amounts of cash payments. Of course, anytime there is access to quick cash, there's a chance of fraud. It makes sense then to have a petty cash book and voucher system. Here's a simple petty cash book showing the date, details, and voucher number, along with the amount of money involved. Notice that on April 16th, the petty cash book was closed out, with a remaining balance of 90 and a total paid out of 110. Here's an example of a petty cash voucher, with data similar to a check, showing the voucher sequence number, the date, the purpose and amounts of the cash used, along with a reminder to attach receipts. There's room for the purchaser to sign, along with the manager. In closing, remember the bottom line is cash is king, and how you manage cash matters greatly.